Greetings, Gators, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the University of Florida's College of Design, Construction, and Planning Research Seminar Series. Your one-stop shop for DCPology. I'm your host, Lisa Sandal-Platt, and we're extremely excited to have a truly remarkable speaker for today's session. Just a reminder for those of you joining us, please keep yourself muted. We'll be recording the session, and if you could keep your cameras off and yourself muted, that'll keep distractions to an absolute minimum. So again, we're very excited to have a truly remarkable speaker for today's session, professor, scholar, book author, and all-around Renaissance person, Sarah Gamble. Sarah is an assistant professor at the University of Florida School of Architecture, where she teaches architecture design studios and lectures on urban design and community issues. Situated within the field of public interest design, her research explores the ways built environment professionals engage, collaborate, and communicate with the public to inform design processes with a concentration on context and place-based information. Focusing on non-majors and the general public in both teaching and research, Gamble aims to bring those outside of architecture into the study and making of architecture to shape a more resilient, accessible, equitable, and well-designed built environment. A fun factoid about Professor Gamble is that she has a miniature building collection with over 50 examples that fit within the palm of your hand, and they're all from her own travels or her immediate family, mostly her mother. I have to say, I absolutely love this information, Sarah, and now feel like you may have launched a miniature building collectors trend. It's the very thing we never knew we always needed. You're going to have to add an influencer to your dossier.
Okay.
So Professor Gamble's talk today is titled A Responsibility to Place, and she will be discussing context and place in relationship to design and the environmental crisis, which are the themes in research from her recently published book, Environmental Activism by Design, which was co-authored with UT Austin School of Architecture's Coleman Coker. I will be fielding any questions you have for Professor Gamble by monitoring the chat, which will be answered at the end of her presentation. She said if you have an urgent question to go ahead and jump in, that doesn't throw her, so we'll go ahead and roll with that. But since we are recording and we'll be posting this session to DCP's YouTube page, if you would please keep your cameras off and stay muted during Professor Gamble's presentation, that would be most appreciated. So without further delay, we will now welcome Sarah Gamble to begin her presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction and the invitation to present today and kind of share some recent work with you all. Yes, I do hope to leave some time at the end for questions and for discussion for those that might have it. But yes, feel free to jump in if there's something very pressing that you need to ask or for a clarification. But yes, let's begin. So in 2015, writer Mandy Lee Cantron published an article in the New York Times titled, "To Fall in Love with Anyone, Do This." The piece made famous a 1995 psychology study on human closeness that she writes, it flips the notions of connection and it assumes that love is an action. So following the original study, she suggests asking a friend, a partner, or an acquaintance 36 scripted questions before staring into each other's eyes for 4 minutes. She claims the intimacy and the vulnerability that the exercise creates leads to greater familiarity and trust. And as we know from personal experience, all relationships begin with this get to know you phase. And that's where I'm going to begin today with my lecture titled A Responsibility to Place. So let me share my screen and kind of dive into some images that can kind of help us along. Let me go to full screen here. So this article, To Fall in Love with Anyone, really went viral and actually became an iPhone app, right, that you all can engage in and find very easily with a quick Google search. But for us, it raises really important questions about this get to know you phase, whether we're getting acquainted with a new friend, a place, or a built environment project. So in architectural education and practice, we too enter into relationships with our clients, with our contexts, with our projects and designs, often engaging with the hope of producing a built work for a very particular place with which we're studying. The way this phase is entered into and conducted tells us a lot about the parties involved, their priorities, their availability, how they want to engage with others. So when successfully undertaken, this initial phase of curiosity centers on open-ended questions, on-the-ground research, and careful observation. So listening deeply, avoiding judgments, and focusing on the need of others are key to successfully understanding people and place. And these discoveries spark our curiosity, right? They leave us wanting to know more about this place and its people that we're studying. So as we, as built environment professionals or kind of allied fields, rally around the world to address the environmental crisis, this approach to kind of active engagement, right? Really kind of investing or intentionally engaging in this kind of getting to know you phase poses a timely method for us and the new ways of how we could incorporate it into our work. So it really aligns with a very simple idea that I'm going to pose to you today, that looking to place for inspiration and guidance offers a simple yet profound way forward within the time that we find ourselves in this kind of world and the climate crisis. And this getting to know you phase with the social, the cultural, the historical, the environmental, the geographical, all the aspects, right? And the people, right, that we're looking to serve. This is really a focus of my larger practice and research, and is really a primary theme of this newly authored book that I'm going to tell you about today. But, many of the images I'm going to show you are from a program, which I'm going to dive into and explain further. And many of them are natural and beautiful, but others are industrial. And so I think we need to be thinking about the sacred or these kind of untouched places that you can kind of see here in my background, but also ones that have been unfortunately damaged or affected by past development. So here we are with Coleman Coker, and you can see here on the left with a group of students. We recently published this book in April 2023, Environmental Activism by Design, and Coleman is a professor of practice at UT Austin at the School of Architecture. He's been in the field for 50 years now. He has a wealth of information and experience, and the students that he engages with talk about the magic that Coleman brings. And so I want to kind of share some of that with you today. So I am going to talk about some of the themes and the research from the book, also how it came to be, and some of the bigger ideas for how built environment professionals can and also do engage with the public, as well as the pressing issues that are facing us all. So here's some shots of the book. It's full of images, which I'm going to share, many of which I'll share with you today. Some drawings, as well as many text that kind of has battling chapters between Coleman and I, bouncing back and forth, as well as featuring 8 thorough kind of completed projects to get a sense of the work. So I want to begin with how this project originated. So back in 2006, Coleman and I met while working in New Orleans doing Hurricane Katrina relief. Coleman was focused on design build studios with Tulane students doing affordable housing. You can see one of the completed projects here through their Green Build program. I was coordinating a university consortium of 17 national and international schools that were incorporating New Orleans-based projects into their coursework and assisting in the rebuilding by producing work that could contribute back to the community. So in essence, I was kind of a facilitator and a matchmaker, helping people find work within the community that could benefit others on the ground. So Coleman and I actually were not present during Hurricane Katrina, but we both moved to the city shortly after and really saw the devastation and the rebuilding firsthand over an extended period of time. And really came to realize that the issues of social equity and in the environmental crisis could not be separated. New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina really brought that to the forefront. And I'm sure you all experienced that in kind of watching the media that was happening at the time. So if we fast forward a couple of years and we get to 2012, actually Coleman and I became colleagues again on the faculty at UT Austin. We both subsequently moved from New Orleans to UT. And Coleman founded a program that is called the Gulf Coast Design Lab, which has now been operating for about 10 years and has 28 or so completed built projects. And I've located many of them for you here on this map. You'll see they're along the Gulf Coast. They're kind of concentrated within bubbles. And this is the inside back cover of our book that helps to locate the work. So the big idea for this new program for Coleman, and I'm quoting him here, is that once we begin to know our environment, we will want to nurture and to protect it. So each semester, the students work with a nonprofit or a public agency to design and build a small structure or an educational tool that supports local environmental efforts for K through 12 students, for individuals with disabilities, as well as the general public. And so embedded into these lessons are environmental education for the public that will use the spaces, but also for the students that are engaging in the coursework. So you can see them here working with oyster shells to create barriers within the water. So they work to address client needs of these nonprofits or state agencies. And at the same time, create spaces for ecologists and biologists and naturalists to teach and research, and for the public to learn and experience the Gulf Coast firsthand. So oftentimes they're working with students from nearby communities like Houston that don't have access to some of these kind of outdoor natural spaces within their communities. And so they're coming to the coast to experience it firsthand. So as I'm showing you some of these images of completed projects, as well as ones of Gulf Coast Design Lab students on the coast here, I want to pause and clarify what I mean by design build education, because we all might not be familiar with that term. This is a popular model for architectural design studios, and it's where students are challenged to realize a design in full construction, in full use. And the model emphasizes collaboration. So in the end, the students are building a project together. So depending on the scale and the academic calendar, some projects will be completed in one semester, and they're designed to kind of fit within that calendar. Other projects are much larger and take several semesters to complete, and often incorporate multiple groups of students to get a project done. And we see that more often with kind of full scale, maybe a single family house. So they're working on an exterior and an interior. In this context for the Gulf Coast Design Lab, they're really working at pavilion scale, these kind of smaller scale projects that can be incorporated or completed within one semester. So if we kind of go back to the root of the program, that if we kind of begin to know our environment, we will want to nurture and protect it, right? So that really takes active engagement, active learning on our part, active listening, and getting familiar. And that's where the kind of like we start to invest in places that we know and understand. So that's really kind of the root of this idea. And so, at the same time, one of the kind of underlying ideas for the book, as well as for the program, is this somewhat of a critique of the way the architectural field has engaged in sustainability over many decades, right? And I think we would all agree that many of the fundamentals of sustainability are essential and key to the work that we do. We need to learn them, we need to understand them from a technical perspective, but also from a conceptual one. But when we look to this idea of environmental education, right, it cannot be substituted by sustainability. And so if we go to the writing of Tom Fisher, he's a thought leader within the world of architecture, but also in architecture and ethics. He's the former dean of the University of Minnesota School of Architecture, and he's a leading figure in public interest design. So in his writing, he highlights how our lack of knowledge has led us to address environmental issues superficially, and often under the guise of sustainability, rather really than examining the root causes of many of our problems and neglecting some of the issues that plague the natural environment and the society that could be damaged by our work. This realization points to environmental education as a necessary precursor and a complement to the profession's focus on sustainability. And I think if you do a quick search looking for continuing education opportunities within the field of architecture that all licensed architects need to partake in, you'll find an abundance of resources about sustainability or maybe LEED certification, but you'll find very few opportunities related to environmental education or learning how to cultivate the skills of intentional observation or looking to place. So we can understand how this premise might underpin the work of a studio, and how it posits that a cultivated respect for our environment can transform our personal practices. So fueling advocacy and activism through architectural design and the process that it shapes. So this research and writing project began with a very short article that I wrote for Texas Architect magazine about one of the design lab projects that had won an award. And it led to an almost 5-year book project that obviously went from 2017 to around 2022, 2023, and we find ourselves here today. So as a researcher, a primary objective of the project was to lay out the process that the design lab undertakes each semester in order to understand and to potentially replicate it within our practice and also in educational settings. So I really approached it in trying to understand the process and document the work along the way so that it really served as a point of institutional knowledge that others could look to in the future. And this is really a lesson learned from my time doing Hurricane Katrina relief, in that we were doing really innovative things and being recognized for the work, but we had a very hard time documenting it or documenting it to the level that people in 10 years and 20 years could really go back and understand it, that it was detailed enough. And really because it takes so much time to do this kind of work. And in the fast pace of disaster relief, we didn't have it. And so in hindsight, I think there's a lot of information that we left on the table that is very relevant to our next disaster and could be applied. And so Coleman and I really went into this with the aim of of documenting and then pulling information from what we found. So a lot of my work was focused on interviews and surveys with clients that had participated with the Design Lab program, and also alumni or past students who'd participated in the design build projects. So we went in to these interviews and surveys looking to garner insights and collective lessons learned about the process. And for us, it was really an effort of looking and listening very intently. So not only did we draw themes or kind of collective lessons, but also we drew direct quotations. And I'm showing you one of those here on the screen. We embedded quotations, direct quotes from clients, as well as the over 40 kind of individuals that we talked with into the book itself, so that we were weaving the voices of others. We didn't want the publication to be just my voice and just Coleman's voice, but we wanted everyone to be included. And so this is the form that it took. We very carefully kind of curated quotations and then embedded them within the text, so that whatever is kind of being discussed in the body of the text is then being highlighted by a quote from one of the participants. So to really kind of embody some of the ideas that I'm talking about, I want to highlight two projects that are completed and are included in the book. These are ones completed both in 2016 and 2017 by Design Lab students and with Coleman as their lead faculty member. And they really kind of embody the ideas in a physical sense. So we're going to start here with Float. So Float is number 6 here on the list. So you can see it in the right most bubble. And it's located within Sea Rim State Park. This is a Texas Parks and Wildlife property, which is the state agency for parks. And the project idea originated from a conversation between Coleman and the superintendent at the time of the park. The park had been hit by 2 hurricanes, first in 2005, and then shortly after again. And much of the park infrastructure had been wiped away. And so they were starting fresh and anew, and they contacted the program because they really wanted to make the over 4,000 acres of wetlands that are part of the state park more accessible to the public. And they really weren't sure how to do this. The park itself spans over 5 miles of coastline. And then its biggest component is these wetlands that in many places are about 4 feet deep and full of alligators, something that we're very familiar with here in Florida. And so the idea of a floating campsite emerged. And this was both of interest to the park system because it offered a kind of backcountry camping opportunity for people that they have very few of within the park system. And it also offered a place for, the designers to create a research spot for ecologists, for bird watchers, for others to either conduct experiments or investigations, to observe kind of deep within the wetlands. It kind of served as a starting point for much of the work. So this was students came and investigated. This is something that's very in the beginning of each semester. The students travel to wherever the site is and spend quite a bit of time over hopefully multiple weekends, really understanding the place and studying, talking to the local experts and those who are really the clients or stakeholders within the project. And they look firsthand. Kayaking, especially in this project and in others, is incredibly important, kind of moving around these kind of wetland conditions and understanding the coast from many different perspectives. They often camp in the places that they're working so that they're kind of going to bed and waking up within this kind of full immersion of the place. The students in the design lab, well, I will say in every project, they manufacture components of their design on campus, and then they drive them down to the coast, wherever the site is. And this allows them to compress the on-site construction time. So over several weeks, they'll have this big tent set up outside of the School of Architecture, and they'll be welding and cutting and building components so that when they arrive on the site, they can have a very quick installation and kind of put the project together. So in this case, they really were going to only have 4 days on site to fabricate the project. So they built all of the components back in Austin and trailered them down. And they had to be very conscious of the depth of the water, that they were only going to be able to use a flat bottom boat to get them out to the site. And the site is about a 60-minute kayak kind of paddle out to this location. So it's quite a distance. And so they were going to have to carry the components over this distance on a flat bottom boat and then begin to assemble it within the water. And so you can see the students standing here as they're working to bring the pieces together. And so with the limited area of kind of fabrication space, some would work and they would rotate, others would be watching for alligators as they're kind of putting the project together and assembling it. The project underneath it has about 8 floats and then 4 weights. You can see a concrete weight here in the right-hand corner that's holding the project in place. And the design itself is really referencing the petrochemical industry that is nearby in Port Arthur. And along the Texas coast, quite a bit of it is actually occupied by industry. And so this is causing quite a bit of environmental degradation. It's also unattractive in many cases. And so the students were referencing those towers, these vertical towers that are like smokestacks within the petrochemical industry, and creating this marker and wayfinding device within the wetland. And so the tower itself, or the height of it, students could, or the public can now see the tower floating with about 30 minutes into the 60-minute ride. Now, the campsite itself holds 4 tents and is open for, you could rent this and go there for the weekend. It's a public campsite that can be rented. And it's still in operation today after we're in like year 7, year 8. But you can see here that Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast and carried this project over a mile off of its site and into the nearby wetland. And fortunately, it was unscathed and has been put back into service. So it's really a testament to the students' design and construction. All of the projects are built to hurricane force winds, but obviously this one is a little bit different in the fact that it's floating, right? It's not on solid ground. Another kind of primary feature is alligator being really conscious of not allowing the alligators to climb onto the platform. And you can see here in this shot, the kind of steel horizontals that register the water, but also keep the alligators from climbing onto it. I want to mention one more kind of detail in the fact that one primary parameter, but also kind of making the tower, adding another function to the tower, is the idea of this leave no trace in terms of using the park system and their spaces. In the tower itself is I would call it a rudimentary bathroom, in that there is a 5-gallon bucket that you can imagine what it's for. It's a makeshift toilet. And so at the end of every stay, the users bring the bucket as well as all of their trash back to the mainland to discard of it. And so it really gave a sense and some really strong design parameters to the tower itself, that they could make it more of a solid screen at the base and then kind of a more porous screen at the top, and really kind of fulfill that vertical marker that they were hoping to create within this horizontal landscape. And the second project I want to talk about is Inhabit. This is in Galveston Island State Park. And it really is representative of the work that the students do in providing shade. That's something that's often sought after by clients. It's often it's a common request for the built work. And so students often are building pavilion-like structures on the coastline. So I want to highlight the location, and it's this is Galveston Island right here. And so it has both a gulf and then kind of an inland or an inlet. And so the park spans the gulf to the bay. And so you can get views of both. It's such a thin piece of land. So as always, the students engaged in the environmental education programs offered by the state park itself. In Galveston Island State Park, the beaches are probably the most popular attraction for visitors. It's a really popular state park. But there is a series of walking tours that the environmental educators often offer to the public. And so they go into the less traveled parts of the state park. They're a little bit more natural, or in areas that aren't beachy. They're more kind of wetland. And so the environmental educators were in need of a new kind of anchor for these walking tours, a place that they could tell people, meet me for the start of the tour. And shade was the biggest necessity. The environmental educators shared how, in order to get people to think and to be comfortable in the place, they really needed to meet their basic needs first. And for many of the students that came, especially elementary school students that are coming to visit the park, they needed shade. They needed a place for them to sit. And so that was the biggest request for this project. So again, the students work through this kind of collaborative design process. Oftentimes in the studios, they each begin with their own kind of design ideas, and they then over time kind of form small groups and then teams, and then eventually as a collective choose one project that they will develop and then eventually build. The projects involve full construction documents, and often there's a collaboration with a structural engineer and oftentimes steel fabricators to build certain components of the projects that those fabricators then come and help install on site and kind of plug together with the student fabricated pieces. So you can see here on the bottom left an image of them at the University of Texas at Austin campus, kind of fabricating, getting things ready, and then moving to the site to install. In this project, welding was a really big component of the fabrication. And you can see these kind of 45-degree tabs that the students had to weld individually, kind of moving down these larger steel elements. And then it was hot dipped to create this kind of galvanized and weatherproof component. So you can see the pieces going together. This Gabion wall is a primary component of Inhabit, and it really kind of, you move along one edge as you kind of move up a fully accessible ramp, and then into the project as you move around the Gabion wall, and then you get this kind of full view of the water, the coastline. So there's plenty of space for a school group. You can imagine the teachers sitting on the bench and the students sitting on the floor, as well as the edge of this raised platform. Many of the projects are raised up off the ground because the sites themselves are the highest site that the design lab has ever worked on is 7 feet above sea level. So really these projects are seen as somewhat temporary. They're permanent in their use, but sea level rise is anticipated, right? These projects at some point are going to be underwater just based on their location. And so they're designed so that water and wind can kind of freely move in and out of the projects over time. This project, shortly after construction, I think really within 2 weeks, was hit by a hurricane and fortunately was undamaged. It did take water moved in and covered the platform, but then it moved out and the project was really untouched. So I want to conclude with talking a bit about my proposal. And so I shared earlier that from all of the data and the documentation, the surveys, the interviews, Coleman and I really worked through themes and lessons learned from the work. And so we each put together a different but complementary call to action on how we as design professionals and allied fields can respond and consider kind of integrating environmental education into our work. And that's the process, but also the end point or the end goal of what's being studied. So my proposal is captured in a chapter titled A Responsibility to Place and really has 7 simple points. And, I'm really coming at this from a process-oriented perspective that I believe these are things that as we engage in design, that we need to be conscious of, that we need to be actively working on. And so I'll give you just a second to read through these 7 points. And then I'm going to talk a bit further just about 3 of them. So let's go to the first one. Take time to notice and to observe. I think this is just a really simple statement that many of us would say, oh yeah, we do that in our work. This is something we engage in, and this is something that we teach our students about. But I'm asking, and I'm kind of proposing to go a step further, to really be trying to cultivate an intentional and active observation. And that type or that how we facilitate that is so different based on the context or based on the architectural site. And I'm not going to talk about this today, but much of my work in a current project is studying how we use walking as a tool to engage and to notice our environment, to really observe and to slow down, and using the motion of the body that we can engage individually in the places that we're working in, but also collectively, right, that we can walk together. And this is just one example or one tool that we as built environment professionals can use to engage in the places that we work. And so it's worth the extra time and effort to really think through some of those opportunities that are likely field dependent or context dependent. I'm also a big fan, and I'll mention, of this book by Rob Walker titled The Art of Noticing. And he really sets out a series of kind of opportunities or experiences that can help us cultivate that intentional observation. The next point is to build up our intuitive knowledge. And I'll use the work of Joseph Albers as an analogy for what I mean. So in his writing, he's a kind of a color theory genius, right? And he's trying to cultivate through a series of introductory exercises in his writing this idea of an eye for color, that we're looking at color from an intuitive sense, and we're trying to kind of train our gut around the idea of color and how the environment or other colors kind of interact with each other. He's not looking at it from a technical perspective or kind of measuring the amount of light that's entering our eye or the way that I might understand a color versus you might understand a color, right? It's not from this kind of numerical quantitative perspective, but it's about intuitive knowledge around color. And so I would say this is very applicable to us and are trying to engage with the places that we work, and really become educated about these environments. And I'll just point out rain as an example, right? We can very quickly go to rain data for a location. We can understand the number of inches. We can look at the calendar and understand when the rain is falling during the year. And we have a very important data set that we can reference in our designs. But it doesn't exclude the need to go to the site while it's raining, right? Or to experience the smell or the feeling of the rain, and to see what happens when it hits the ground, what kind of sounds are created, or how does this impact the flora or the fauna that's around it. And so this type of engagement takes time. And so it really takes us, or maybe our employers, being really intentional about setting time aside for these type of activities, which can be very easily overlooked when we're kind of in this fast-paced design environment, or we're working to a deadline or a certain budget. This point, being open to collaboration, I think we all know the importance of collaborating with others, with other built environment professionals when we're working and practicing. But we need to expand the way that we collaborate with the community, and you can see that here in the example. How do we engage stakeholders? How do we embed community engagement processes and learning within our curriculums or within practice? You know, how are we offering continuing education around this topic? But also being open to collaboration with individuals that might not have had a seat at the table in the past. And these might be directly related to place, you know, for example, conservationists or bird watchers, other people that have direct knowledge of the place itself, and can bring in nuanced information about a site or an area to our attention, and can collaborate and provide feedback in the design process. And finally, to seek out opportunities for environmental education. And I think this is very well done by Coleman and the program, and something that really attracted me to try to learn more and to really understand this model for education and practice. That we can invite those that are environmental experts into our projects, into our process. And that might be as simple as inviting them to a studio to talk about an environment, maybe inviting someone from a different department that has an expertise, or maybe a park staff member or an ecologist, right? We can think of all the opportunities, but inviting them into the process and really embedding environmental education into what we do to really transform oftentimes the way we begin the design process. So I'm going to conclude here and open it up for questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts and to provide any kind of clarifications about the book or the work that's contained within it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Please, okay, we do have a question. Great. We've got a couple questions. Ava, if you want to unmute yourself, please feel free to ask Professor Gamble your question.
Hi there. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious about how potentially ephemeral or temporary projects might demonstrate a responsibility to place, and like how that differs from maybe more of the permanent projects you presented here.
Sure, that's a really good question. I mean, I look at temporary and permanent projects through a very similar lens in relationship to place, right? That I come from the perspective that it's our responsibility as designers to get to know the places that we work in whatever facet that the project, like whatever form the project might take on. So in terms of kind of ephemeral or temporary, I think it's very context specific. And so it really kind of speaks to some of maybe the tools or the techniques that I talked about today in trying to engage and then draw on place to inform these temporary installations. And I think we could all point to many different, especially public art examples that are both temporary and permanent, that really try to accomplish that.
We do have another question that has come through the chat from Sarah Rifke. Sarah says, great book. Have you noticed any changes in students' perceptions or attitudes toward architecture for the public and vulnerable communities after they participated in these projects? And the second part of this, if so, have these changes been measured?
Yeah, well, one of the tools that we use to record and then to measure those changes are really the surveys and the interviews. And obviously, it's a big time commitment to try to document all of these words, through an IRB process that we're asking the same questions kind of over and over and over again. But yes, I would point to many of the quotations in the book where the students are reflecting back on the experience, sometimes 5 or more years later. And many of them bring the experience into the world that they're in now, into practice, and say, this lesson I can see now within the working world, or I can see this in my own projects. And one thing that comes to my mind is a quote from a student who said they learned firsthand the problems that architecture could address and the problems that it couldn't address. And so that's a really kind of real world perspective on what is the possibility of our design profession and how we need to work with others to address issues that we may encounter in our work, but really go beyond our kind of realm of influence.
Okay, Sarah says, very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Again, please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you have any other questions. There is another one that's come through private chat. I think you touched on this, but maybe you could elaborate on it, Sarah. In your opinion, how do you see the idea of increased environmental literacy impacting future educational practices for design, construction, and planning? And the second part is, and how will this continue to impact the practice of architecture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, maybe I'll speak a little bit from the architecture perspective. We're producing what we hope to be future licensed professionals, right? And that education or that curriculum is very regulated, right? And very regular. Like, we have to hit a lot of benchmarks along the way. And unfortunately, environmental education isn't one of those benchmarks. And so, the ways that we could embed it in some of these kind of guidelines for how we shape our curriculums might be one way to affect change. I think, I can just say for architecture, I mean, we don't have the time within our curriculum likely to embed a required course on the topic. But as faculty members, we can all discuss elements of the environment or bring opportunities for environmental education into the work that we're doing already. And that might just be inviting a speaker on a topic related to that within a studio, or using one module within a course to talk about the topic. I think if we just find opportunities to kind of embed it into what we're already doing, it's a much more kind of likely scenario that we're going to get some traction in moving it forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got another question that's come through the chat. This is from David Rifkind. Thank you for a terrific presentation. Have you and your collaborators conducted post-occupancy evaluations of your projects?
That's a good question. No, not in the technical sense. I think the clients that we spoke with, doing one-on-one interviews could really speak to the use of many of the projects. And so, for example, Inhabit is used by 3,000 to 4,000 elementary and middle school students a year. And so they're taking part in the environmental education efforts of the state park itself. And so that's an interesting idea that we might find a way to survey these young students who are using the location. But post-occupancy, I think, is a really important facet of these smaller projects, and really could, in hindsight, could have added another layer to the research.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? We still have time for a few more questions if there are any. I for one am fascinated, Sarah, that alligator spotting may be a core competency that some design teams need to consider adding to project execution. I'm curious, in addition to fending off things that could eat members of the team, were there any other natural hazards that you had to consider when you were doing this work?
Well, I think the alligators stand out as something really tangible and something that we're familiar with. I think rather than hazards, I think sensitivity is maybe more of a focus of the students trying to understand how you work in a wetland condition or a coastal condition that's likely going to take on water periodically. We often are taught to keep water out, and we spend a lot of time on waterproofing and trying to create barriers. But in these projects, the students were challenged to bring the water in. So trying to understand how they create porosity and create a structure that's going to withstand a wind and rain and these kind of harsh conditions over time. Many of them are very remote, and so they're getting very little maintenance. They're really kind of left to fend for themselves. And there is one project that was destroyed. It was titled Dune, and it was kind of knocked down by a hurricane, unfortunately, but all the other ones have weathered the storm. And that's also due to collaborations with structural engineers in helping to understand those hurricane force winds and the kind of best practices around designing for these harsh environments.
That's interesting that it's clear that there's a really delicate balance that needs to be struck when engaging in this kind of work.
Yes. Yes, I would also point to, say, footings or concrete. That's something that the students often have to come to some sort of realization or reality of what it means to pour concrete in a wet environment. We oftentimes in architecture school are just mesmerized by the possibility of concrete, but then we overlook the kind of environmental concerns around the material and what it means to actually put it into place. And so it's amazing to see how the students kind of limit the amount of concrete that has to go into these projects, just so that they're limiting impact in these really sensitive areas that are, oftentimes state parks or refuge areas and are highly protected.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have one. last question for you, Sarah.
Sure.
As you're working, and those of us who have grown up in studios or taught in studios, when you move from individuals generating ideas, and often, that's the way our processes play out, or you have small teams, to actually moving forward with one project, how do you ensure that engagement stays high? It seems as though there are those students that leaders that are going to really rise to the occasion and become highly engaged, but how do you continue to sort of pull in and make sure that learning happens for the group? And were there insights that you learned in terms of pedagogy and student engagement?
Yes, totally. I think we've all taught studios where we've seen, yes, the leaders kind of rise to the occasion and others kind of follow along, but others who lose interest. And that's really one of the challenges, I think, in design build education, along with all of the other logistics that come along with building a project. And I can say that the interviews and the surveys, many alumni commented on the magic that they thought Coleman brought. And so for me, that was a really big learning opportunity to try to understand what they meant, what the students were just, they thought really provided the energy and the kind of collective engagement that these studios have. And I think in looking at the work, you can see here what is accomplished in one semester. I mean, it's pretty miraculous. And so in trying to deduce what the magic is, I think one of the things that stood out to me is how leaders are kind of silently behind the scenes cultivated. And also students are very delicately led to take ownership of different parts of the project. And I think that's a really nuanced teaching kind of, how you do that without making it kind of overt or feeling like students are excluded or included into certain parts of the project, I think is really delicate. And Coleman has mastered that. Many students commented on how that takes shape. And so for me, I think for us all, there's still learning to be done. But it's a really important point.
Well, that's a great question to end on. Thank you, Meg. So I really, really want to thank Professor Gamble for her fascinating and engaging presentation today on a responsibility to place. The College of Design, Construction, and Planning has a great lineup of presenters for the research seminar series this fall. So be on the lookout for more information about the next speaker in the coming weeks. And until then, a big thank you again to Sarah Gamble for getting the research seminar series season off to a great start. And thank you as well to the rest of you who joined us today for this session. Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you all.